Buenos días. It's a pleasure to introduce Wahutu Siguru, who is a friend and a colleague. And I had the pleasure to be on his committee while he was doing his PhD at the University of Minnesota. And now he's an assistant professor at NYU, the New York University's Department of Media, Culture, and Communication. And he has, let me tell you a little bit about him. He has a law degree from Eldoret University in Kenya. Then he got his undergraduate in sociology at the University of Minnesota, and he continued towards the PhD. And he's also a faculty associate at the Berkner Klein Center of Internet and Society at Harvard University, where he spent a year as postdoc. And he's the author of the book titled In the Shadow of the Global North, Journalism in Postcolonial Africa. And in the talk today, he will share some of his findings. And well, we look very much forward to learning from your work, Wahutu, and thank you for coming and being with us today.
Thanks. Thank you everyone for having me, and thank you for taking time out of your day to kind of humor me in this talk. Now, the way the world works, I had slides and everything was going to just go clicking. And now we have a PDF, so the movement may be just a bit slow, but please bear with me. So as Alejandro said, this is kind of a snippet of a book project, a book that should have come out in April, and then my university press was hacked, so we don't know when it's going to come out. Last I had, it's supposed to come out in November. But this is just a piece of that to just, let you know the universe in which I'm working in. So in this talk today, I begin from the premise that journalists also, when I get really into my work, I speak really fast. So please just let me know if you want me to slow down. Yes. I begin from the premise that journalists engage in the construction of knowledge and reality while contemporaneously relying on already present knowledge, right? So they're doing this thing where they're relying on something while also creating it for us real time. And one way this construction occurs is by constructing narratives that are reliant on sources acting as, to borrow from Joachim Sabelsberg, who was here a few months ago, knowledge entrepreneurs, right? These are people that have specific types of knowledge and they leverage their institutional access to ensure that what they know becomes part of the dominant narrative. As Leon Sridhar once argued, the news is not what happens, but what somebody said happened. Mm-hmm. With this in mind, it's crucial to understand the social context within which journalists are immersed in to engage in meaningful analysis. This point is even more critical when scholars focus on Africa, where there's often an insistence of scholarship by analogy. A scholarship by analogy approach sees journalists as either being professional or not, depending on how far away or close to global north norms about what journalism should be, and depending on how far and close they are to their global north counterparts. So think about every time I think about how journalism operates in Africa, but I would also say in Asia, there's always an insistence on they're doing something wrong because we're comparing them to the journalists we know here and the norms we have here. We tend to think of those norms as being automatically universal. In the Shadow, which is the book, pushes back against this scholarship analogy approach by focusing on how journalists in Kenya, Rwanda, South Africa, and Nigeria constructed knowledge about the atrocities in Darfur between 2003 and 2008. Darfur being a region in Western Sudan that has had multiple variations of violence. This particular project focuses on a 5-year period that led to the ICC leveling charges of genocide against the regime in Khartoum and some rebel forces, and those rebel forces are the ones causing chaos in Sudan today. This affords me an opportunity to unearth three distinctive discursive struggles unfolding in the African journalism space. The first struggle is what it means to be an African journalist. The second is what it means to be a good journalist. And the third is what it means to be African in the post-colony. Before we dive into the data, a brief discussion about the theory and methods. In the Shadows analytical approach is more on a framework that argues that when studying journalism on the continent, it is pertinent to be conscious of the continent's colonial legacy, current social context, and how these two things work to shape the field. I argue for a theoretical model that combines field and postcolonial theories and is grounded on a sociology of knowledge approach, arguing that the racial qualities of both field and postcolonial theory allow scholars to immerse themselves in a universe of actors that are influenced by shared rules of the game, what Bourdieu calls doxa, while being influenced by social reality constructed within a macro environment of colonial logics, what Bourdieu loosely refers to as habitus. A sociology of knowledge approach allows us to understand and appreciate the broader contextual nature of taken for granted knowledge by African journalism fields and the actors within them. Gillian Gow and Monica Krauss define fields as social spaces of relation that are defined by struggle over valued resources. In the book, the struggle is of a narrative dominance and the question of who has the credibility to have their narrative about Darfur and atrocities in Africa become the dominant one. Gow and Krauss also remind us that field theory offers a set of concepts especially generated for analyzing transnational processes and relations. Because field theory does not have already predefined boundaries, its boundaries can be stretched and retracted as needed by scholars attempting to understand organizations operating at a national, regional, and transnational level. Another reason why field theory is apt for this project is because it allows for disambiguation between doxa, what we think of as norms, and habitus, what we think of as social or cultural contexts. Right? It allows us to kind of, analytically at least, treat these two things as distinct and see how both of them affect how individuals operate within organizations. One way to think about it is, for the scholars working in this building, how does you being somebody that lives in Madrid and somebody that may be Spanish, how do those two things affect how your professional identity within this building operates? What are the things you sometimes have to give up to be able to be seen as being an objective scholar, right? And do those two universes ever align? Valentin Mudimbe defines habitus as an accretion of internalized lessons that the agent has learned over the course of their socialization, or, as Benson and Nouveau, while quoting Bourdieu and Vauquin, call it, a socialized subjectivity. Consequently, habitus enables actors to operate within their social world as a fish in water, serving as a matrix of perceptions that informs not just how we come to view the world, but also how we move in it. While African journalists espouse multiple habitat that align with their various identities and social realities, they also have what I see as an Africanness that allows them to exist and move like fishes in water within the continent. This habitus of Africanness enables journalists to define the relationship with their audiences and their continent or country, while discursively defining their roles with the global narrative construction in Africa or their home countries. Bourdieu defines doxa as a system of presuppositions inherent in membership of a field. Doxa is part of a professional field's rules of the game, a game in which actors, as Benson and Nouveau remind us, make an emotional cognitive investment in the stakes involved. Doxa should thus be understood as taken for grantedness of social practice, working towards aligning one's actions and reactions within the field. The shortest way to think about doxa is, this is how things work, right? You're gonna like it, but these are the rules. There's a bureaucracy and it's slow, but you need to accept that because this is how things, and nobody can ever explain why it is these things work the way they work, but it's just loosely understood as that. In the Shadow also leverages postcolonial theories since African journalism fields are ensconced within a larger macro environment profoundly shaped by colonial logic. Articulations of an African journalism field have to be cognizant that such a field will be reflected by pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial realities that make it prudent to engage both field and post-colonial theory. Post-colonial theory is thus meant to capture the coloniality of doctrine and its influence on who narrates Africa and why. Using both theories treats colonial logic as a macro environment within which the fields of power are embedded. While this use of both theories is helpful, it does not sufficiently cover the knowledge repositories the journalists rely on to frame their narratives. It does not tell us what types of knowledge regimes they find worthy of sharing. For this, I rely on the third part of my framework, the sociology of knowledge. Sociologists Max Weber and Robert Park and political theorist Kwame Nkrumah all alluded to the fact that newspapers act as knowledge repositories and are vital in the construction of knowledge. We have similar arguments about audiences' perceptions of the world, depending on how much and what type of news they consume. A sociology of knowledge grounding allows In the Shadow to eschew the tendency of scholarship to rely on assumptions from the West to explain context and realities in the global South. This reliance has led scholarship on African journalism to share what Julian Doe's homologies of imperial epistemology. This homology undergirds notions of shortcoming at this juncture, rather than an appreciation of African journalism fields making decisions based on the lived realities and context. Sociology of knowledge asks us to take seriously all actors participating in the production process and pushes us to focus on the actions of journalists and the knowledge repositories that they find relevant. So that's kind of the underpinning of the project, right? Now, we begin with Kwame Nkrumah. In 1963, Kwame Nkrumah, at the Second Conference of African Journalists, argued that sustaining a genuinely free press in a capitalist sense was nearly impossible in the post-colony. He worried that journalists would find themselves selecting and rejecting facts based on whether or not they aligned with their employer or affected the news organization's bottom line. He was concerned that the pressure for competition for advertising revenue would encourage sensationalism and jeopardize unity and peace in these newly independent states. While it may be easy to read these concerns as seeking to tamp down on the notion of a free press and objectivity, it's essential to note a few things. One, on the question of objectivity, Michael Schutzen argues that objectivity as a norm only becomes a serious professional discussion point in the 1920s. That's in his speech in 1963. Kwame Nkrumah is talking to journalists at a time when objectivity is not a settled dogma in journalism. Additionally, Max Weber had in 1910, as you can tell, I'm a sociologist. I keep throwing all the sociologists around. I always have to wave that flag in this project. And in 1910 argued that the press was not primarily a capitalistic enterprise, since it served two masters, the audience and the advertisers. As such, the press could find itself having too many buyers, but never too many advertisers. Consequently, Weber argued that we needed to understand how raising revenues would affect public opinion formation. We've recently seen these similar debates in the US and the UK following the presidential election of Donald Trump in the first round, and in the UK following Brexit. You can also hear his foreshadowing of Habermas's concerns over the shift of journalism from one of conviction to one of commerce. Finally, Nkrumah's concern also echoed other media luminaries across the continent, from Hilary Nwano in Kenya to Mkwabi Kilala in Tanzania and Mamandara in Nigeria. There was a generalized sentiment on the continent around this time that the press was meant to lay a foundation upon which future generations would thrive. For these media elites, a purely capitalistic press was likely to be inimical to the goals of the new state. For some, the state's outsized role or influence was in no way a threat to the profession. Thus, Nkrumah, himself a former journalist and media owner, was in effect echoing a concern that early media practitioners in Kenya, political elites like Thomas Mboya from Kenya as well, and scholars like Weber had been and Habermas would be raising. Another speaker at this conference was Professor William Abraham, a philosopher who had joined the Department of Philosophy at the University of Ghana in 1962 after spending time at Oxford. Dr. Abraham warned that one of colonialism's enduring influences was education. He worried that Africans run the risk of adopting attitudes and desires that were inimical to their actual day-to-day existence in the continent. His concern was not misplaced, since at independence, several organizations from the global north, such as the International Press Institute and the Ford Foundation, came into the continent with the express function of creating what historian John Jens has called an African profession in the Western image, or, as Gerard Loughren has stated, a white profession with black faces behind the desks. Key actors in this educational push were characters like Tom Hopkinson, who IPI relied on to turn, as Hopkinson argued, quarter-made journalists into half-made journalists. There was also a plethora of scholars such as Don Lerner, Wilbur Schramm, Everett Rogers, who viewed journalism on the continent not only as underdeveloped, but also as potentially helpful in breaking what they saw as stubborn traditions and ushering in modern lifestyles in Africa. Always modern is shorthand for American, right? These early years in the post-colony sort of captured the beginnings of a discursive struggle over what it means to be an African journalist. These actors engaged in a struggle that sought to understand very precisely how journalists could align their identities as Africans, here in think of Bourdieu's habitus, with that of journalists in a profession whose normative approach, doctor, was significantly affected and influenced by the global north. That's when Nkrumah was arguing that journalists had a duty to understand African societies in relation to the outside world. He was taking the first step of articulating the alignment between habitus and doctor in a post-colonial reality. What is important here to remember is that this particular struggle was unfolding and arose from both journalists and non-journalistic actors, right? So we have politicians, we have all of these sorts of scholars that we hold in high regard, but also we have journalists like the folks in Kenya and in Tanzania and Nigeria also espousing this very same narrative, right? And also the other thing is, it also didn't necessarily occur in journalistic spaces. It also occurred in non-journalistic spaces, in books, in scholarship, in policy documents. And the topics of this particular, let me see if I'm reading that. Yeah, topics of this particular discourse were both reactive to the idea that we were having an influx of trainers that were coming from outside the continent, but also very generative, right? Because it points to this moment where these folks are imagining a different kind of journalism, a different kind of world, a process that Adam Getachew calls the process of world making, right? They were trying to sort of think about this new dawn and creating a world that they viewed as needing to be radically different from the world of the departing colonialist and imperialist states. The second discursive struggle is one based on the definition of good journalism. I spent several months at a journalism school in Nairobi, Kenya, and attended classes from the undergraduate, master's, and PhD levels from Monday to Saturday, often attending 2 classes a day on average. On Saturday, there were 3 classes. I was interested in 2 interrelated questions. The first was how one came to embody the professional identity of a journalist. And in Bourdieusian terms, I wanted to understand how actors came to inhabit a social universe that produces knowledge about the continent for Africans. The second was how they came to cover conflict once they came to embody this journalistic identity. To the question, I hope that's okay. To the question as to why students were keen on embodying a journalistic doctrine, they often mentioned a love for writing, tinged with a sense of duty. This articulation is not unique to students, since journalists from as far as Nigeria and South Africa often alluded to this love of writing and sense of responsibility as well. As we see in this slide, the student and the journalist articulate similar reasons. Their habitus led to them wanting to make an emotional and cognitive investment in the stakes of the journalism profession. I'll give you a second to read that before we move to the next slide. To the question of why conflict, of more importance here is how students gain their doctorate right? In the classes I sat in, syllabi were dominated by scholars from the global north. Students were likely to read work of David Alcaiden or Robert Ekman than they were to read Francis Nyam George or Saint Moray. As a result, students who spoke were more likely to embody a doxa that Nyamjo argues is deaf and dumb to the particularities of journalism in Africa by virtue of an education centered on global north scholars. To the question of why conflict, right? You see from most of the interviewees, covering conflict wasn't necessarily a different thing from covering day-to-day politics on the continent. As a journalist, at the bottom says, conflict is often, is what did you say? Almost a daily occurrence, right? And then corrects himself and says, frequent, not daily. And the student up there is talking about the only thing that can make these people know their rights is by me engaging in civic education as a journalist, right? In both kind of approaches, there's this sense that I need to do something different as a journalist, as African. The journalist at the bottom is Kenyan. The student up top was from South Sudan studying in Kenya. So there are two ways that doxa unfolded. One was in discussions of what was considered good journalism. Students often focus on organizations such as the BBC and CNN when they talked about norms as if they were universal, rather than contextually bounded by geographies. They spoke of the profession as a liberal institution within a social context where, as Tawana Cooper reminds us, liberal democracy and notions of press freedom are nascent and fragile. One effect of this doxic embodiment is seen in who the field views as credible knowledge entrepreneurs for African narratives. So, when you're looking at this slide, just 1 minute, let me pull up something. When you're looking at this slide, that's the blues here are sources that were from South Sudan, right? So, a couple of things are immediately happening. The South Sudanese sources dominate the conversation. So that's one. Two, I want you to think of this graph here as split into two right here. So these first three are stories that are published, are filed by African journalists in African newspapers. These next three here are stories that are credited to Reuters, AP, journalists from the US or whatever, also showing up in the same newspapers. So immediately, what you then see is that within these news organizations, within these newspapers, there's almost this tension between local journalists and foreign journalists, all publishing in the local newspaper, right? But for this particular slide, I just wanted to focus on the fact that lots of the sources are Sudanese. When you look at the Kenyan news organizations here, the Kenyan journalists on the left, you see that the Kenyan sources that they quote, it's a very small number compared to the Sudanese, but also very small compared to the Americans, right? And at the top here are the other group, and then this group are UK sources. So in Kenya, Kenyans are much more likely to hear from Sudanese sources, American sources, and English sources, whereas Kenya was providing peacekeeping troops in Darfur. The Minister for Defense was heavily involved, the military was heavily involved, the police were heavily involved, but you hardly heard from those people. One of the most well-known critiques about how Africa is represented in the media is that African voices are often silenced through their absence in the number of sources quoted by journalists. And when they do show up, they're typically treated not as experts, but as bystanders with little or no agency, more like props on the stage than key players. So imagine my surprise that the data showed that African journalists rely more on American and English sources than sources from Kenya, Rwanda, or South Africa combined. In each of these countries, when journalists had the agency to select voices that would count as a counterweight to Sudanese sources, they always favored sources from the global north over those from the continent, at times over those even from their own countries, such as Kenya. So that's one. So you're much more likely to hear from then Senator Joe Biden than somebody that was Kenyan, than even the Kenyan president. right? While peace negotiations were also happening in Nairobi. So that's a fast issue where this notion of doxa plays a very dangerous effect into who's being given a voice in African newspapers. The second shows up.
I'm sorry, maybe I missed something, but what's different between NSF and Siguru?
So the NSF, I'm just going to say, so the NSF here are what they call the Kenya's national subfield, right? And I'll explain what the national subfield means later on. But the national subfield, think of it as national subfield are African journalists, right, that are operating in these countries, hired by these news organizations. The cosmopolitan subfield includes your Reuters, your New York Times, Washington Post, AP, AFP, whose stories are also appearing often on the same page of the same newspaper, right? So here, this here shows the effect on doxa on editorial decisions of credibility. The stories credited to African journalists only accounted for 38.13%. So this blue here, you remember the NSF category in the previous slide? Okay, so this is the total number of stories that they published out of 100, and the total is up here. So this accounts for 38.13% of the total number of stories published in newspapers in 3 countries. And this up here are stories by Reuters, which accounted for just about 47% of the stories across all 3 over the time span. Now, often people say, well, Rwanda has more African journalists covering the events in Darfur. But there are 2 things to realize. One, Rwanda's stories count in the total number of stories that show up, account for a very small percentage of stories. 2, Rwanda's stories about Darfur were not stories about Darfur, but the stories about how well their military was doing in Darfur. Right, so Darfur was almost this side story to how effective their military were and the awards the military was winning, especially considering that they had come out of a genocide 20 years ago. So those were essentially what you'd think of as celebratory stories about Rwanda's achievements. So how can we explain these counterintuitive findings on sources and this bifurcation that they talk about here? On bifurcation, many typically tend to explain the positive stories by African journalists as a byproduct of an economic logic. You often hear something like, well, it's more affordable to lift stories from global north organizations. I argue that this is a faulty logic and misses critical factors. Both the first graph and the second graph capture why there were concerns about the curriculum in those early years of training and how they come into focus. One of the things ever present in those early days of journalism education was the notion that the global north journalism was the standard to which every other news organization had to be compared. Organizations such as Reuters and the Associated Press were seen as arbiters not just of news, but of quality news. Especially concerning, as John Jens has shown, is the fact that the British government, at the eve of independence, decided to secretly fund Reuters to ensure that they would have an eye and influence on these newly independent countries. Both slides show that news organizations are steeped in what Mpini Muhammad calls an everydayness of colonization, where individuals and organizations from former colonies are devalued by the formerly colonized. At the same time, those from the imperial or colonizing countries are presented as the default and canonical organizations against which all other knowledge is to be measured. So again, remember when we started, I talked about how a journalist is seen as being professional and capable or not. It's by how close or far they are to these norms we think of as universal, but are often Western norms. As a result of this everydayness, journalism in Africa is bifurcated today in roughly similar ways as it was bifurcated during colonization. While the bifurcation then was between indigenous and settler-owned or colonial-owned news organizations, as shown by Phoebe Musandu and Kristen Newell's books, Today, it is between organizations such as Reuters and AFP publishing their stories about Africa in African news organizations. This bifurcation results in what I term the cosmopolitan and national subfields. This is the NSF and the CSF. There are two things I want you to think about when you think about these two subfields. One, live in places where expatriate communities live, and they interact amongst themselves. So and because they're paid a salary commensurate to what they'd be paid in a US or in a European country, their levels of income and they're really high in the socioeconomic ladder compared to the local journalists. So there's hardly, if ever, interaction. When I was doing this fieldwork, I remember I joined the Foreign Correspondents Association service, and they would have events in very wealthy parts of the city and hotels that are in Nairobi. But I always, when you walk in, you have to show that you belong. And often those rooms had little to no African journalists in that particular space. I was often the only black one in Nairobi. Right? So this is the universe that these groups exist. Each subfield has its logic for covering the continent. Still, both compete for different species of capital by constructing a narrative about Africa and Africans within and outside the continent. The struggle results in national subfields playing the role that Bourdieu calls pretenders, rather than what Hall refers to as primary definers. Right? So, because there's such a minority here, they end up not being the dominant voices in that particular space about things happening on the continent. That role of a primary definer is sort of outsourced to the cosmopolitan subfield, which is made worse when you remember that previous slide and just how dominant voices from the US and Europe and other European countries, which is this brown one here, right? This one at the very top. How much those groups dominated in comparison to sources from other African countries. Okay. Oh, wow. For clarity, colonizations every day is also when journalists select whom to quote as a source. In the minds of many in the continent, Senator Joe Biden had much more important things to say about Darfur than the head of peacekeeping, General Arthur Gwai from Nigeria. Now, the sidelining of the myth journalist. In this exchange, the journalist discusses their experiences and how frustrating it is. But I want to focus on the fact that the journalist discusses that even when African journalists were sent to cover an event, and for this journalist they had traveled to Libya and everywhere else, their home organization would sometimes publish a Reuters story instead. Yeah. This complaint was repeated numerous times and points to the fallacy of the economic constraints logic. This particular complaint was also voiced by journalists when they were sent to cover international events happening in Kenya, who found that their work would be sidelined by editors in favor of stories from the cosmopolitan subfield. For this specific journalist, let's say this building was their news organization, maybe half a block north is where an event was happening. Okay. And they would go cover that event, come back. The next day, their story has been killed, and they see a Reuters story about the same event that they attended. Right, so this is why I'm arguing the economic constraints logic doesn't really hold, especially when this is happening over and over again, and especially for this journalist that also went to Libya. The news organization is spending almost $5,000, $6,000 to send them to Libya. So they've already spent the money anyway, and they're deciding we will not use that story that we have already paid for. But now I want to turn towards how the atrocities in Darfur were framed as an avenue to highlight the third discursive struggle, a struggle over what it means to be an African in the post-colony. Specifically, I focus on the presence of the ethnic conflict frames in stories by the national subfield. The presence of this frame is interesting since it has always been viewed as problematic when used to discuss conflict on the continent. I explain the presence of this frame in three ways in the project. One, ethnicity being a lived experience. Here, ethnicity is treated as a social reality. Thus, journalists use it to provide conceptual order for audiences. Its presence in coverage then becomes a tool to provide a recognizable discourse on and understanding of identity. As a Kenyan journalist reminded me, we've been ethnic for ages. One way to think about the function of ethnic identity in these particular stories filed by African journalists, ethnic conflict in these stories filed by African journalists, is to think of ethnic identity almost as analogous to the way race operates in the US. Whereas in the US, every story will have a racial angle, because that then ends up, that is part of their day to day, right? It's a lived experience, and they talk about race in very specific ways in the US. But if ethnicity is part of a lived experience, the second explanation kind of relies on this and says that would then suggest that a lot of these stories are reporting what the source says about the identity of the people fighting, right? So it then becomes unsurprising that it shows up, since one might expect that knowledge entrepreneurs would be talking about protagonists using ethnic identity. This is especially key considering in that slide about sources, the most sources quoted by the subfields were Sudanese state actors, right? So when the Sudanese state actor is talking about ethnicity, they're talking about it as a lived experience, as a thing they're familiar with, and they expect the journalists to also be familiar with, right? And that then means that the way it may show up in a story filed by Kenyan journalists is radically different from the way it may show up by journalists that is not from the continent, because ethnic identity doesn't play the same role for people that don't live in that space. But despite all of this, I argue that this frame is an engagement with the memory and trauma of colonization. It reflects a politicization of who is African in the exclusivist sense and who's an outsider. This exclusivist sense restricts Africanness to an identity akin to Leopold Senghor's Negro African, and refuses to traverse any geographic lines between North and Sub-Saharan Africa. As a Kenyan journalist stated, Arabs in Sudan are viewed as brown colonizers who settled in Darfur from the Middle East. Thus this frame, the ethnic conflict frame, defines an other and links them intertextually to a global other. An other where in a post-9/11 world, if you're labeled as Arab, there are these connotations to terrorism, right, and possible terroristic acts. Its use here continues a political project that seeks to determine who belongs and who does not, as the excerpt captures, right? The journalists here say, we don't see North Africa as real Africa, right? It's this thing that exists, but it's not really part of us, right? And this type of attitude pervades in the way journalists talked about those that they define as Black or African and those that they define as Arab or Muslim, right? You tended to see it show up in very specific ways. To conclude, three major discursive struggles unfolded in how Darfur was covered in these countries. The first is about the role of African journalists in post-colonial Africa, and is anchored in post-colonial debates about the role of journalists in the new independent countries. Starting from that 1963 speech by Nkrumah, I hope I've shown how various actors engage in this struggle. It was not limited purely to the political realm, and included elites from multiple walks of life. Non-African actors as well, such as Wilbur Shaw and David Lerner, were involved in the struggle and viewed the profession as key to modernizing Africans. This latter group wanted to Americanize the profession, while the former sought to make it contextually relevant to the continent. This struggle captures the sense that many journalists, editors, post-colonial leaders had, that journalists' habitus needed to play a more significant role in the field than the embodiment of doctrine. The latter was alien to the region and was informed by realities and contexts not too dissimilar to those of the departing colonialists. In relation to the coverage of global events unfolding on the continent, such as the atrocities in Darfur, the second struggle focused on the role of African journalism in shaping narratives on the continent. On the one hand, as I've discussed, the national subfield is playing second fiddle to the cosmopolitan subfield, and arguing that this is a financial decision is often inaccurate. On the other hand, even though journalists complain about being marginalized locally, they also silenced African voices. This preference is anchored on the global north continuing to be considered as having experts, but perhaps more importantly, actors insist on performing doxa while suppressing habitus, in the hope that the former will allow them and their profession to be viewed and to be treated as respectable global actors, a fact that is yet to happen. The final discursive struggle is one based on identity and belonging. 4 years after that Nkrumah speech, Leopold Senghor, Senegal's first president, gave a lecture at Cairo University, laying out his idea of what being an African meant to him. He defined Africanness as a combination of Arabism's values and negative. While for Senghor, being African traversed racial and geographic lines, Africa was both Arab and black. Other scholars, like Frantz Fanon, argued that the colonial split between the north, typically coded as white, and south of Sahara, typically coded as black, would come to be embraced by the nationalist bourgeois of white and black Africa. While journalists may not have explicitly discussed Frantz Fanon in articulating how their background affected their approach, one can hear the echoes of Fanon in sentiments such as the last one about real Africa. To conclude, I hope I have shown the importance of taking African journalism seriously as an intellectual enterprise and a profession engaged in knowledge production with all the complications that brings with it. As you leave here today, think about how much you know about journalism or other professions and institutions on the continent, and how much of what you know is based on scholarship that insists on comparing African institutions and professions with their analogues from the global north. What do we miss when we focus on this comparison? Thank you.
What we did, also to talk, we have time for questions or comments, and who's from there? Okay, Jones, like that.
I have a question basically to expand, no, because you've focused on media networks.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if, now media networks are obviously crucial in the, as you have expressed, but what about other media that may be more independent or were discontrolled, by cosmopolitan, networks is lesser? For example, radio. Mm-hmm. What's going on with radio or the social media, for example, or mm-hmm. In the social media, what's going on with the flow of information, of the construction of information about Africa, mm-hmm. From an African point of view, mm-hmm. both in the radio, which I understand that radio continues to be crucial for the circulation of information in African countries, and is not controlled, so to speak, in the same ways as you are describing for the networks, no? Mm-hmm. For the big media events that you are describing. No? So if you can elaborate a little bit on this this part.
So there are a couple of things, right? So I'll talk about radio in Kenya and then talk about radio everywhere, right? So radio in Kenya, let me rephrase that. The journalism field, the media field in Kenya is controlled by three major organizations, right? These three major organizations have newspapers, have TV channels, and have radio channels, right? And all of these sort of subsidiaries almost get their information from the center, which is Nairobi, right? So the TV shows will set in the morning, and then they'll have the newspapers from the same stations, and then that news sort of filters down into the radio stations. Even the radio stations that speak indigenous languages, right? They kind of do this translation process that is coming from headquarters in Nairobi, right? What this then means is that if you watch the TV news in the morning, you can anticipate what you're going to hear in the radio throughout the day, right? But the radio is also one of those outlets that is able to update information much quickly. So by the time you listen to the radio in the evening, you could sort of anticipate what the news organization is going to have as part of their front story page, right? Now that being said, radio comes with its own challenges, which are often, the structures and the radio masts and the radio masts in a lot of spaces in the continent are still the same masts we had in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, right? In a lot of countries, actually, the radio is tightly controlled by the state, and any other sort of pirate radio that may show up sometimes shows up and disappears very quickly because they have to sort of anchor themselves on the broadcasting channels that already exist. But the state holds all the certificates for the broadcasting channels. So the state can easily decide to yank it, and there's really nothing much you can do about it, right? What has changed, to be honest, are kind of podcasts. But the danger with podcasts is, and focusing on podcasts typically is, you're then focusing on a very specific economic stratum on the continent that not only can afford the internet, but also can have like smartphones to download these things. And people often go, yeah, but the internet is really cheap on the continent. I go, yeah, it's cheap if you're coming from Spain, right? If you're living there and you're living on $2 a day, the internet is really expensive. So you will not use it for the radio in that way, right? You may use it for other things every now and then, but not necessarily for the radio. And if you do get into the internet, for a vast majority of people on the continent that have smartphones, your internet is Facebook, right? Because you're going through a Facebook portal onto this outside world. So those are some of the complications when thinking about radio, when thinking about social media, right? Is you have to be very, analytically, you have to be very crisp and clear in how you're going to sort of pass out these particular structures. Mm-hmm. Now, is that to say that they're not doing something that's useful? Well, not really, because what we've also seen in this past summer is a lot of youth organizing on social media and protesting across Kenya at the same time and overwhelming the structures, right? So you have these moments where the younger generation can connect on social media platforms, can connect on like messaging platforms like WhatsApp, right? And then lead to a mass movement. But then, that's Kenya, where it works really well, where the internet tends to be cheaper than a vast majority of the continent. But that's not necessarily Nigeria, right? That's not necessarily South Africa. Mm-hmm. And the truth of the matter is, a vast majority of Africans kind of live in the shadows of the technological revolution. Like that kind of highway, they don't even have access to it, because the things you need to get access to it are just too far out. A couple of years ago, there was a statistic that talked about how 60% of the continent is not connected on the internet. Of the 40%, almost 50-some% of them could only afford crappy internet that showed up between midnight and 2 p.m., right? That was the Midnight Express, right? But smartphones cost 41% of the household income. So even fewer people have those, right? So there is, even those that can afford it, a vast majority of those people rely on terrible internet service to be able to access a weird, decrepit corner of the internet, right? So while they're connected, they're still marginalized in very specific ways. And those are often the challenges, right? Whereas with newspapers that I focused on here, two things happen. One, there's a habit on the continent, in all of these countries that I went to, where people read the newspaper and then debate the newspaper, right? So while the circulation numbers may be low, in this room here, I may buy one newspaper, Alejandro may buy another newspaper from a different organization. We read it and we debate the newspaper that way, right? So newspapers have this weird reach where even if somebody cannot afford the TV or the radio, they will hear about what is happening in the newspaper because people will be talking about it in town squares, right? And that's why I kind of focus on the newspaper. And somebody may not buy the newspaper today, but they may be able to get it 2 or 3 days from now. So it's late, but it is getting there. And those are sort of the nuances of kind of studying the space. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, see, I was thinking about one specific case in the Republic of Congo, no?
Mm-hmm.
Radio Okapi, no?
Mm-hmm.
That because one student of mine wrote a dissertation on that, and she was in Republic of Congo, and this was, I understand, an independent radio station, yes, which worked with a lot of international NGOs, and they got every prize you can imagine in Europe, and basically could bring technology to the places they needed this technology to be, because this radio is basically a radio of support of women who have been abused during the conflict, sexually abused during every kind of conflict in Congo, which has been in war for I don't know how many decades now. So I was thinking about this particular case in the sense that radio may also offer some kind of independent avenues. This may be a specific and only case in Africa, but my question was more in this sense that.
It's interesting, right? Because it's funny, I was thinking about Radio Copy as well. But then I realized Radio Copy is very unique, right? The guy that founded Radio Copy is, I think, Canadian something, right? It's a very unique case, because when something similar was tried in South Sudan, it just did not work, right? And for some reason, a lot of South Sudanese folks kind of rebelled against this particular radio station, because they felt as if the radio station wasn't focusing on their needs, but was focusing on the needs of the NGO, right? And it was really weird. Radio Copy is one of those weird, sort of unique unicorns that I'm yet to see be replicated in any meaningful way. But perhaps one may argue Radio Copy's success is brought up by the fact that the central government is not really strong in the Congo, right? Like, I really got people wouldn't necessarily work the same way in Kenya. They would shut it down so quickly, right? But in the Congo and the uniqueness of that place, I think so, and maybe that's why we've been unable to kind of replicate it across the continent. Yeah.
Thank
Yes.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I have two questions. The first one, I wondered if you could build on whether it came in your interviews with the journalists, whether if they are aware of their biases and how they respond to those, like in the sort of reflexivity, the way Bourdieu uses reflexivity. And the second one was a question about the types of capital, also in a Bourdieuan sense, which I don't have very clear at the moment, but I think it came up very clearly, the economic capital from your presentation, the political capital as well, the educational, but I was wondering if you can build on, for example, what you were explaining about how people listen to the radio or how they read the newspaper and then discuss, whether if that sort of practices play out in some way with the journalist training. I'm an anthropologist. So.
Yes. So a couple of things, right? I think, well, all the journalists I spoke to, regardless of which country they were in, right? The things we tend to think of as biases were treated as, we can use that to tell a better story, right? So typically when we talk about journalistic biases, we talk about journalistic biases as sort of operating almost as blinkers, right? Which then means that you can only see this thing and you can only integrate it in one way, shape or form, right? For the vast majority of the journalists, their sense was, especially in this case, they're like, no, I'm African, and I realize I'm African, and I realize I'm Black, and I realize I'm Christian, and my sympathies will lie with those folks because I understand them better. Like that was always the logic, right? I understand them better. But immediately they say that, they would always turn around and say, yeah, but these Westerners come here and they'll just talk to a few people and go and write a story that already is fitting with an overarching narrative about what the continent is. For them, they were like, these things that we treat as, that we may understand as biases, those are the things that allow me to tell a story that is different, right? Those are the things that allow me to tell a story that humanizes a lot of these folks and humanizes the continent, right? As a few of them say, being African made me want to be a journalist because I wanted to correct certain narratives about the continent, right? So while there is a level of reflexivity, i.e. what am I doing and how is this affecting my output? All of those things were not necessarily always treated as negatives by journalists that were in the field. Now, by the students was a different conversation. All of those things were treated as biases in a very negative sense, because all of those things are the things that they were reading as bad, right? So journalism could only look a certain way. Journalism could only look a way that Robert Entwin understands journalism, Wilbur Schramm understands journalism, not as something that needs to be articulate to the continent. Those things that make journalism articulate to the continent, that can be loosely defined as specific types of biases that may be negative, they view them as qualitatively bad, right? And we need to just not do that. So they would say something like, yeah, I see how CNN covers an event, right? And then, actually not, and they're not bringing any biases to the story. And you sometimes have to go, yeah, but they have an American bias. They have an American bias that they're bringing in, right? They did not view that as bias. They viewed that as good journalism, which was, you know, as a researcher, you're like, my head is exploding in very different ways. Right? So there's that. But I think there is reflexivity, but reflexivity almost operates in a way that allows them to make sense of the chaos, right? To a certain extent. Because also, going to the capital conversation, also, the reason why opinion journalists will quote Senator Biden is because it gives that journalist a level of symbolic capital amongst their colleagues that a Kenyan source would not give them, right? So in that pursuit of capital, right, you seek the symbolic capital and you express that by citing these Americans and these Europeans. And the higher up the food chain you go, the sort of more capital you get, with the hope that you can convert that into economic capital, because you could show the field, look at the people who have access to, then use that to negotiate either a better paying job somewhere else, right, or higher contract. So capital in this sense works that way, right? You kind of, and this is what I mean by doxa almost seeming sometimes harmful, right? Because one of the things about journalism is state actors, regardless of what type of state actor they are often seen as having the right type of knowledge that people should get, and often make themselves accessible, right? Now, in the state actors, there's also a hierarchy. Where is this state actor from? A state actor from Kenya is lower down the pole than a state actor from the US, right? And then a state actor from the EU is somewhere close to the top, right? And in that process, you're a human being, you need a paycheck, you need a job. You will seek those actors that are higher up the food chain. It just so happens that those actors fall outside the nation's boundaries, right? So, you know, that's one way to think about capital in this way, right? This idea that we seek this to convert it to this, to convert it to the other thing. So on the symbolic capital, we will cite Joe Biden. On the casual capital side of it, right, once I cite Joe Biden, I can maneuver that in very specific ways. I can maneuver it to go, look at me, I am the expert on thing X, right? I know how Americans think when it comes to thinking about the continent, right? And that then affords you certain things. So you've moved from the symbolic to the cultural to kind of give this aura of somebody that knows American state actors' thought processes, somebody that can predict these things, which then means you're invited to the TV show, right? You're invited to think XYZ, you're invited to the radio to kind of give your opinion in a very specific way. All of this is typically in the service of economic capital, right? So those play out that way. Now, when you speak to students, the radio is seen as being lowest on the totem pole, right? It is not even a thing that students think about as a worthy place to go into. They think of newspapers and they think of TV, right? TV is at the very top, then newspapers, right? Then the radio down here. And in that sense, students that want to specifically go to the radio are seen as having even less sort of capital, right? That they can convert into any kind of meaningful economic capital, right? And so those people are few and far in between in these schools, right? For most people, it was the TV that into other species of capital when the time was right for that.
I have a follow-up question,
Yes.
and I'll stop. So how often does this happen that the Black African journalist is able to convert all these different types of capital into becoming the expert, considering the white experts who are much more reliable?
Much more experts.
Experts.
Yes. A couple of things, right? It happens a fair amount. So one of the quotes I had was from a journalist who, across the continent, is viewed as the expert in Sudan. Like, I was speaking to journalists in Nigeria, and they were like, you need to talk to this person in Kenya, right? So there are journalists that kind of are able to do it. Now, to be honest, not that many, just because, A, the higher up you go, the narrower the field gets and the expertise gets. But B, even that journalist that was considered an expert across the continent was having their story pushed aside for Reuters in their own news organization, right? So there is this disjuncture that happens where you're viewed as an expert, and even people in your own media house says, yeah, we have this guy that is amazing. But that very same person in the media organization says, yeah, that guy is amazing. But when he's busy, we'll often get a story from somewhere else. And you go, yeah, but couldn't you get a story from another journalist in-house? They go, no. I mean, the Reuters people are better.
Yeah.
Right? And it's a weird sort of whiplash that happens. So, again, as I often say, analytical clarity becomes very important. And how are we leveraging expertise in this space? Right? Are we leveraging expertise in this space in terms of who's known across the continent? Okay, fine. But does that then lead to anything else? Well, not really. And often the economic benefits are not that high, right? Not unless, again, here, you go to the BBCs, you go to the CNNs, you go to the New York Times, and you leave your home organization to join this other organization. Yeah. In Nigeria, it's not about moving to the transnational organizations. Typically, it's about moving into PR, right? Because that then pays more. So it depends on which side of this divide you're looking at. Clean.
Thank you.
There was a hand back there, I think, or no?
Thanks. This follows on quite nicely from this discussion. I have a question about class, and specifically the class in terms of economic class of the people who are attending journalism school and teaching in journalism school. I wonder whether that also, or to what extent that feeds into this idea of the doxa and the kind of hegemonic acceptance of the global north. Specifically, kind of building on, at one point, I forget if it was an interlocutor or a quote where you said, colonialism has had this impact on education, and thinking also of Bourdieu and his work on class and consumption. Do all of these things kind of combine to really tell us about a story about class in journalism and the extent to which what you're describing is a kind of class project in which a hegemonic public sphere is being created. And then this kind of goes to the question about radio and other media, and are there counter-publics that are also being created and being quashed, as you mentioned? Because, and sorry, the last point was that I love that you brought in Fanon at the end, because I feel like Fanon actually brings a whole different take on the story of Doxa and Habitus, and whether that's also a line that can be expanded further to develop this kind of critical analysis of class in journalism and in public spheres.
Yeah. I'm going to start with the last one. I think, yes, I think Fanon is very useful in expanding the conversation, especially expanding the conversation within the context of the post-colony, right? And what does this mean? What does it mean when you have this national bourgeois that does things that are sort of counterproductive, right? But because of the national culture, they also want to look like those people, right? The people that left. This is the famous. The native it doesn't necessarily want to kick out the colonizer because they hate the colonizer. It's because they're jealous of the colonizer, right? I think class has a big. I don't really dive into it in this project, but class has a big role to play in this because the editors that I mentioned early on, right? Those were the cadre of people that sort of replaced the departing colonists as they were leaving, right? Those are people that were very high up on the socioeconomic ladder, right? And what they were doing is they were sort of engaging, weirdly, they were engaging in this, for lack of a better phrase, Marxist notion of what the press needed to do, while at the same time embracing a weirdly capitalistic sense on this side. So Hilary Mann says, what is the use of fighting for press freedoms if we cannot tell the story of the poor and the wretched? Okay, this is all true. But Hilary Mann was trained at Harvard, right? He's also this very same person that was keen on making sure that the capitalist class structure in Kenya was sort of maintained at a very specific level because, those at the very top could be viewed as having a paternal approach to the country to kind of bring the country and nurture the country in a very specific way. So when future generations show up, right, when people like the Ford Foundation, IPI, Tom Hopkinson show up, one of the things that Tom Hopkinson says to the people he's training is that your stories should focus on the government officials, right, and not the man in the biscuit factory, because the man in the biscuit factory is only interested in sports, right? Like that was part of the manual. Yeah. So Tom Barton writes a handbook as to how journalism should operate in Kenya. And you can see echoes of this. Don't worry about the biscuit factory people. Right? This is not for that. So how this then manifests later, and part of the argument I make is when these ideas about what good journalism shows up, I argue, and I've always argued, that those for me are sort of code words as to how to move as if you are white, you are American in this space, right? But being white and being American is this aspirational conversation about being upper middle class, right? This is sort of stories you kind of tell are going to look a certain way, right? The stories about poverty are treated as human interest stories, not structural issues, right? And what can we, the good people, do to help this woman that is really poor? Well, what can the state do? Because the state should be doing certain things. So when the editor is saying the Reuters story is better, the editor is saying this group that I have aspirations of joining in one way, shape or form does a better job to teach my local journalists here how to be good journalists. Right? Never mind that this is a newsroom where everybody on the continent is saying you have the expert on this story. Right? So I think on the class issue that kind of shows up in that way. But this then means that journalists that work for the newspapers are journalists that are literate, are journalists that probably went past high school, went to journalism school, went to majored in political science or international relations, etc., right? So the text, in a very Marshall McLuhan way, the text defines who's educated, who's much better. The radio, because it is oral, right, is viewed in very specific ways as for the masses, but for the masses that are not well off, poorly educated, and the only way they can communicate is orally, right? TV kind of is this audiovisual thing that combines both of them, so it's in a weird space. But even the TV suggests that you have enough disposable income to own a TV, right, and to keep up with that technology. So we have this sort of, there's a phenomenal book by Ginger Nolan talking about the global village, right? I think it's called the neoliberalism of the global village, or something along those lines. We have this attitude that is often unsaid, but is basically texts and newspapers are for people, and they're written in English, right? Are for people that are highly educated. And as such, working for a newspaper is elite in a very specific way, because you're talking to what we can think of as the tastemakers out here, right? And those people have the role to allow the man in the biscuit factory to have somewhat of a better life, right? So it is a story about class. It is a story about class, but also, to be honest, I don't feel qualified to get into that debate, right? But I think for now it is a good way to sort of expand that conversation. Thank you. Right.
I have a question, Wahutu.
Yes.
On the selection of your cases of these conflicts. So you mentioned journalism as a liberal profession and liberal democracy is nascent and it's fragile in these countries. So why did you select these? And connected to that question is what are your conclusions? Apply more or less, it seems, from what you said, applies to all these countries, and whether there can be an outlier in a country that is not part of your sample, or whether that could be the case, or why.
Yeah, so I have to say, when Alejandro asks me a question, I'm stressed out because he was my dissertation committee chair, and I immediately went back into that room during the defense. But two things. I think, so the reason I picked these countries is all of these countries had troops in Darfur. So that was, for me, that was an okay, so which countries are involved in Darfur? But secondly, and most importantly, Kenya, Nigeria, and Rwanda are the three regional powerhouses. The other one is Egypt, or was Egypt, right? Those are the kind of the powerhouses on the continent. So these three countries sort of set the pace in the ways you think about how journalism should operate in those regions. And these countries have journalism schools that attract students from the region. Right. Now, one way to think about, does this apply to like Francophone Africa? I would say yes, in very specific ways. Those students in Francophone Africa are finding themselves having to learn English, right? So a lot of American embassies have English classes. American embassies in Francophone African countries have English classes. But those students are also going to Nigeria, to South Africa, to Kenya for journalism school, right? So they're sort of being trained in these very specific ways. So I think I would argue on the debate about being a journalist, being an African journalist, and those differences, I think, comfortably speaking, those are happening across the continent, right? Now, on the notion of being African in the post-colony, I think that may be somewhat different, right? And how that shows up. It may be different in Francophone Africa, because Francophone Africa has tended to have a closer relationship to France than Anglophone Africa has to Britain, right? And I would imagine there are very specific particularities when it comes to that. There was a study by Alan Findlay done a few years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago now, that kind of looked at journalism in Anglophone and Francophone Africa, and A, how journalism was taught, but B, what are some of the things that journalists in these countries thought of as important. They look the same across the board. So, the journalism of Robert Anton and Wilbur Schramm is showing up in these places, and either by the students coming into these countries to learn, or, to be quite honest, these countries sometimes sending scholars to these Francophone countries to actually teach. So I would say on the two sort of discursive struggles, those are much more generalizable. Yeah. And I like I said, I picked the countries because they were involved in Sudan. There are major economies in the region. Rwanda was different. While it was involved in Sudan, part of what I was interested in is how did the ghost of Rwanda and their own genocide show up in the way they covered Darfur? Right, but this is why I say Rwanda's coverage is weird, because they kept talking about how well their soldiers were doing, less about the atrocities, right? And that was a strange outlier, which then meant that most of the stories were going to be told by Rwandan journalists, right? Because these journalists would interview soldiers when they came in, or would be embedded with soldiers and police officers in Darfur. Yes.
Any other questions? Well then, thank you, Wahutu, for coming.
Thank you so much for having me.